Hello, and welcome to week 2. We are going to be covering, as always in this class, we're going to be covering courts, but we're going to start moving into more what I would call specificities in the courts. So we're going to look at the breakdown of our two major types of courts in this textbook, and that's the state courts and the federal courts. It may seem like a simple division of labor, and in some ways it is. But we need to know exactly what it is that the state courts here versus what the federal courts here, because those are two different jurisdictions of court systems. So let's start with the federal court system. Just real kind of service level, high altitude view of that. Our federal courts are going to hear cases that are, to no big surprise, federal crimes, federal cases. These federal cases are going to be things like, what's some examples of federal crimes? Tax evasion is a federal crime. Crossing state lines to commit another crime can be a federal crime. So these are our federal crimes. Whereas state crimes, regardless of the severity of the crime, it can still be a state crime. A lot of folks will confuse the severity of the crime with the jurisdiction and think like, oh, well, murder must be a felony crime, or excuse me, must be a federal crime. It is a felony, but it must be a federal crime, but it's not. In general, murder is a state crime. If you look at the state statutes of just about any state, they list a statute against homicide. So murder is in general a state crime, unless we're talking about crossing state lines in order to commit said murder or facilitate that murder. All the way down to things like misdemeanors, like thefts or assaults, things like that. So those are all going to be our state crimes. State crimes are going to obviously have to be prosecuted in the state in which they are the offense occurs. So one of the things that I'll give kind of an example. So I used to work at a university in South Dakota, and there's a fairly famous case in there, the Tammy Haas case, where there was a very significant challenge in prosecuting that case. So uh, the short of it is, Tammy Haas was a young woman who had just graduated high school about a year earlier, and she was found dead just off the side of the road in a rural area. And there's a lot of speculation and investigation to determine, did she die by accident? Did she die by homicide? And how do we prosecute this case? The challenge, another challenge in that case, was it was right on the border of South Dakota and Nebraska. In fact, she had been in Nebraska at a party the night before. Everybody saw her in Nebraska, but her body was found in South Dakota just a few feet into the state. And like I said a few moments ago, a state crime needs to be prosecuted in the jurisdiction in which it occurred. And you can't use federal statutes to prosecute if you don't know which jurisdiction it occurred. You can only use that federal statute if there's a crossing of state lines. So the challenge was, did that, if it was a homicide, did it occur in South Dakota where her body was found, or did it occur in Nebraska and she was moved? Which was it? And that, not only did the investigators need to show and the prosecutors needed to show that a homicide occurred, because there was a lot of conflicting evidence as to whether or not she was killed by accident or killed by homicide. Not only did they need to prove that a homicide occurred, they needed to prove where that homicide occurred in order to have a successful prosecution. In this particular case, they ended up trying one individual and he was found not guilty, and they were never able to retry that case. So it still remains, at least on paper, still remains unsolved. So let's talk about the different levels of these jurisdictions. We've got the federal jurisdiction and the state jurisdiction. So the federal jurisdiction, talking about federal cases, the very first point at which a case enters the court system is going to be what we call the court of original jurisdiction. And that court of original jurisdiction at the federal level is going to be called the district courts. Now, we have a lot of districts in the United States, and your book talks about the numbering systems of them. But once that case is heard, and these district courts are the courts that are going to hear actual crimes. They're going to find guilt or not guilt. They're going to determine the facts of a case. Once that is finally finished and a verdict is handed down, then a federal case can proceed to, if the Uh, if one or more parties choose to, it can proceed to the appellate courts. These appellate courts, they also have a numbering system. Instead of having district numbers, they're going to have circuit numbers. And circuits in the federal system cover usually many, many states. So the district courts hear the original case, the circuit courts hear the appeals cases or the appellate cases, and then finally, we have the Supreme Court. One thing to keep in mind about the Supreme Court is the Supreme Court is just you know, if it makes it easier to understand, it's just another appellate court. It just happens to be the final appellate court. And they also, don't have to hear very many cases at all. And a lot of times, the Supreme Court of the United States hears less than 100 cases, so they don't have to hear every appeals case that needs to work its way up. They can decline to hear those cases. Now, when it comes to the state courts, we also have a court of original jurisdiction in the state courts, but even before that, we have a limited jurisdiction uh, series of courts. And that limited jurisdiction series of courts is going to be things like traffic court or city courts, county courts, things like that. From there, we have our original jurisdiction courts. A lot of times we call those superior courts or general jurisdiction. And from there, we have the same options in the states. We have the option of going to the appellate process or just accepting the verdict as it is. One thing to keep in mind about the state court is that because some states are so small and so rural, that not every state has an intermediate appellate court. Like the federal system has our appellate courts and then Supreme Court. There are some states that only have a Supreme Court, and they are the original, or excuse me, the appellate jurisdiction for the entire state. There just aren't enough cases to justify having an appellate court and then a Supreme Court to hear even the final cases. The Supreme Court will just hear all the appellate cases, but that's only on the state level. Again, the federal level will always have the circuit levels of appeal, and then the Supreme Court. States have the lower jurisdictions, the limited jurisdictions. They have the general jurisdiction, which is our court of original jurisdiction, the where we hear the guilt, the innocence, actually hear the crime, the criminal cases. From there, depending on the state, there will always be some sort of appellate court. It's just, will they have an intermediate appellate court and a Supreme Court, or just a Supreme Court that hears the appeals? So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview. If you have any questions, then don't hesitate to reach out, and I look forward to seeing your assignments this week.